People often think of love as something loud, the chemistry, the grand gestures, the emotional declarations, and those moments that feel impossible to overlook. But some of the deepest kinds of love are almost silent. They live in quiet companionship, steady presence, and that peaceful feeling you get when someone's presence simply feels like home. For someone with avoidant patterns, that kind of quiet can communicate more than words ever could. Lasting commitment rarely begins with dramatic romance or endless reassurance. It usually grows slowly from something much more important: emotional safety. Someone who has spent years depending mostly on themselves may not become closer because of emotional intensity. What truly allows them to open is realizing they can experience strong feelings without losing their independence or becoming overwhelmed by what they feel. Many people with avoidant tendencies learn early that emotional closeness can bring discomfort. They may begin associating intimacy with criticism, pressure, loss of control, or having their personal boundaries ignored, so they create distance to protect themselves. It isn't always because they don't want love. Sometimes they simply learn that keeping people at a safe distance feels easier. Then they meet someone who doesn't try to tear their walls down, someone who respects their space, understands their pace, and doesn't turn every moment of distance into a conflict. Slowly, something unfamiliar begins to grow: peace inside connection. And that peace can become the doorway to deeper commitment. The more secure they feel in their independence, the easier it becomes for them to naturally bring you into parts of their private world. You don't have to chase them, convince them, or repeatedly prove why they should remain. What matters is creating a relationship where their defenses don't have to stay switched on all the time. With someone who has avoidant tendencies, emotional security is usually built through consistency rather than intensity. They notice how you behave during disagreements. They remember whether you respect their need for space. They pay attention to what you do when they become quiet. They're watching patterns. And when you remain emotionally steady, instead of responding with panic or pressure, something inside them can begin to shift. They start discovering that love doesn't automatically mean chaos. Closeness doesn't have to mean losing themselves. That realization can be deeply healing. Eventually, they may begin offering small pieces of themselves they once kept hidden. They contact you more frequently. They share little details about their day. They invite you into their routines. They become more comfortable simply being around you. A morning message, an invitation to spend time together, or a rare admission about something that frightens them may look insignificant from the outside, but for someone who has relied on emotional distance, these can be major acts of trust. What they're really communicating is simple: I feel safe enough to let you closer. And that can mean much more than a dramatic declaration of love. Their version of commitment may not look like the romance people usually imagine. It may not include constant affection or endless verbal reassurance. Instead, it often appears through reliability. When they genuinely commit, they're not merely saying they love you, they're choosing to remain emotionally present, even when their instinct tells them to retreat. They're taking the risk of letting someone see parts of themselves they have protected for years, because they believe the connection is worth the vulnerability. It takes time. It can feel uncomfortable. But once that choice becomes real, it can become remarkably deep. For someone with avoidant tendencies, forever may not sound like 1,000 promises. It may look like simply staying. When they allow you into their world, they're not just sharing their time, they're challenging years of learned emotional self-protection. Their love may be quiet, but quiet does not mean shallow. They may show affection through consistency instead of intensity, understanding instead of control, and peace instead of emotional drama. In that sense, commitment becomes more than a promise. It becomes a movement from fear toward trust, from isolation toward shared peace, and from constantly protecting themselves toward finally believing they can remain connected. And one of the clearest signs of that change is when they begin choosing your presence instead of automatically choosing distance. People with avoidant patterns are often associated with pulling away, but withdrawal isn't always proof that they don't care. For some, closeness activates a deep fear of losing their independence. Intimacy can feel like a threat to freedom, so retreat becomes their automatic way of handling difficult emotions. But when that pattern starts changing, something important is taking place. They begin moving toward connection instead of constantly escaping from it. This doesn't happen overnight. There may still be days when they want closeness and other days when they need more space. They can feel caught between two strong needs, the desire to be loved and the fear that love will consume them. What helps resolve that conflict is experiencing a relationship where they don't have to choose between intimacy and independence. When they discover that your closeness doesn't require them to surrender who they are, their mind and body can gradually begin to relax. They learn that being with you doesn't mean losing control. It can simply mean sharing life while still remaining themselves. At first, the changes may be so subtle that you barely notice them. They stay a little longer. They talk a little more. They don't immediately leave after spending time together. They become comfortable sitting beside you without needing constant conversation. These small moments can reveal a major internal change. Their nervous system is slowly learning that connection can feel calming instead of threatening. Where there was once tension, there is now comfort. Where there was once an automatic urge to escape, there is now curiosity. Your presence gradually becomes connected with peace instead of pressure, and that is a powerful psychological shift. When someone with avoidant tendencies begins wanting your presence, it can mean they no longer experience closeness as an emotional invasion. They aren't necessarily looking for constant contact. Instead, they're beginning to appreciate the stability and comfort of having you nearby. You become someone they can relax around instead of someone they feel they must escape from. Their walls usually don't disappear because someone attacks them or demands that they open up. They soften because repeated experiences of trust teach them they don't need those walls every moment. You may notice them reaching for your hand, sharing a thought they would normally keep private, or becoming completely comfortable sitting beside you in silence. These gestures can look ordinary, but for someone who once depended heavily on emotional distance, they can represent enormous progress. They're learning that safety doesn't have to exist only when they're alone. It can also exist in another person's presence. And wanting closeness doesn't mean they suddenly stop needing independence. Healthy intimacy allows both realities to exist together. They can have space without turning that space into emotional separation. They can remain close without feeling controlled. They can open up without feeling completely exposed. They're no longer searching for freedom by running away from connection. They're beginning to discover that freedom can also exist inside a safe relationship. That is what makes this stage so meaningful. Their love becomes less about performance and more about peaceful companionship. They choose to stay near you because they genuinely want to, not because they're being pressured, chased, or obligated. Their quiet loyalty, their comfort around you, and their willingness to share ordinary moments can become some of the strongest signs that their feelings have matured. And when someone who usually values distance starts seeking your presence, you may have become connected to something deeply important within them, their sense of inner peace. You become the person around whom they don't feel the constant need to run. But there is another layer that matters even more. When they finally begin revealing the chaos they normally keep hidden, that can become an even deeper expression of trust. Because allowing you to see what exists behind their calm exterior means they're no longer simply letting you into their life. They're letting you see the parts of themselves they normally keep protected from everyone else, the fears they don't usually explain, the thoughts they usually keep private, the uncertainty behind their confident exterior, the emotional confusion they may have spent years managing alone. And if they can show you those parts without immediately retreating, something significant is changing. They're discovering that vulnerability does not always lead to rejection, control, or emotional pain. They're learning that being fully seen does not automatically mean being trapped. This is where intimacy becomes much deeper than physical closeness or romantic attraction. It becomes emotional permission. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to need someone. Permission to admit fear. Permission to say, "I don't know what I'm feeling," without immediately disappearing. And that kind of openness cannot be forced. It has to develop through trust. So if you notice these subtle changes, don't overlook them simply because they don't look dramatic. A person who once kept everything inside may be communicating love through small acts that carry enormous meaning for them. The message may not be loud, but it can be clear. I am learning that I don't have to protect myself from you. And once that belief begins taking root, connection can start feeling less like a threat and more like a place where they can finally breathe. They're letting you deeper into themselves. For much of their lives, people with avoidant patterns may have learned to treat emotions as something dangerous. Vulnerability can feel like an open door to getting hurt, while relying only on themselves can feel like the safest way to survive. So they build an inner world that looks controlled from the outside, even when everything inside feels uncertain. Beneath that calm surface may be fears they rarely discuss, insecurities they almost never admit, and a deep feeling of emotional isolation. Allowing another person into that private space requires an enormous amount of trust. So when someone with avoidant tendencies begins showing you what is truly happening inside them, it isn't a small or casual gesture. It can be one of the deepest forms of emotional commitment they know how to express. In their own quiet way, they're telling you that they no longer see you as someone they have to defend themselves against. They see you as someone who can witness their truth without turning it into a weapon. People with avoidant patterns often live behind emotional defenses designed to protect them from uncertainty and emotional unpredictability. They've learned to keep their feelings contained and appear calm even when they're struggling internally. Their desire for distance isn't always a rejection of love. Sometimes, it is simply the method they've learned to use when they need to protect themselves. So when they finally stop hiding everything behind that composed exterior, something important has shifted. Their urge to withdraw begins becoming less powerful because they've discovered that your presence doesn't necessarily make their internal world more chaotic. Instead, being around you may actually help them feel calmer. It usually starts with small revelations. Maybe they tell you about something painful from their childhood. Maybe they admit a fear they've never spoken about. Maybe they share a personal experience they normally keep completely private. To another person, it could sound like an ordinary conversation, but for someone who has spent years protecting their inner world, every piece of personal truth can represent another part of the wall coming down. As they experience acceptance instead of judgment, they slowly begin learning something they may have struggled to believe for most of their life. They don't have to be perfect to be loved. Vulnerability doesn't automatically end in rejection. Being seen doesn't always mean being controlled. And allowing someone to become close doesn't necessarily end in pain. Their vulnerability may not come out perfectly. They might hesitate. They might lose their words, change the subject, become quiet, or even apologize for showing emotion. They may have trouble explaining exactly what is happening inside them. But underneath that awkwardness is something deeply meaningful, a genuine desire to be understood. At this point, they're no longer working so hard to appear completely untouchable. They want understanding more than admiration. They don't need you to believe they're flawless. They need to know that you can see their imperfections and still remain emotionally safe. Opening up can also become a quiet test of trust. Someone who has spent years expecting rejection may wonder what will happen when you finally see the parts of them they consider difficult, vulnerable, or even broken. Your response matters greatly. When you meet their honesty with patience instead of criticism, they begin developing a new understanding of what love can actually feel like. They slowly learn that love doesn't require them to hide every weakness, and eventually, their vulnerability can move beyond fears and painful memories. They may start telling you what they genuinely need. They may ask for comfort, reassurance, understanding, or even space, instead of simply disappearing. That is a major turning point for someone who survived emotionally by keeping everything locked inside. Revealing their inner world can become one of their strongest expressions of trust. It's almost as if they're saying, "I'm allowing you to see the parts of me I normally keep hidden." And that is where guarded affection can begin becoming genuine intimacy. Their love doesn't have to be proven through dramatic actions. Sometimes the strongest expression of love is simply telling you the truth and allowing you to see that their internal struggle is not a sign of weakness. In many cases, it can actually show that they've become strong enough to stop hiding. They're not necessarily asking you to solve everything for them. They're asking you to understand what they're carrying. And when you respond by staying present, instead of trying to control, pressure, or fix them, the relationship can slowly begin feeling less like a battlefield and more like a place of safety. But there is another powerful sign of deepening love that deserves your attention. It appears when someone with avoidant tendencies starts protecting the relationship instead of only protecting themselves. For a long time, their instinct may have been centered around self-preservation, protecting their independence, avoiding dependence, maintaining emotional control, creating distance before they became too vulnerable. Love can feel deeply attractive to them, while also feeling dangerous. It offers warmth and connection, but it also creates the possibility of loss, betrayal, disappointment, rejection, or feeling trapped. So when they begin protecting the relationship itself, it shows that something important has changed. The connection is no longer simply something they fear might hurt them. It has become something valuable enough to protect. Earlier in the relationship, someone with avoidant patterns might disappear as soon as conflict appears. Silence can feel easier than explaining themselves. Distance can feel safer than sitting through difficult emotions. But as their feelings deepen, they may begin staying even when things become uncomfortable. They may still need time to process. They may still struggle to communicate perfectly. But instead of abandoning the connection completely, they begin searching for ways to repair what happened. That movement from escaping toward repairing is enormous. It means the relationship has become important enough to compete with their automatic urge to withdraw. They also begin noticing your emotional experience instead of focusing only on protecting their own boundaries. They may pause before reacting. They become more aware of how their behavior affects you. They begin understanding that protecting their own peace should not require destroying yours. Love slowly begins changing from self-preservation into mutual care. This doesn't happen because they suddenly become an entirely different person. It happens through repeated experiences. They notice your patience. They learn that you can respect their independence without trying to control them. They experience a kind of love that doesn't demand that they abandon themselves. And gradually, they may begin offering that same sense of safety back to you in their own way. You may notice them responding differently to their triggers. When they're overwhelmed, they may still need space, but instead of disappearing without explanation, they tell you they need some time. When an argument happens, they may still feel uncomfortable, but they begin making an effort to work through the issue rather than immediately walking away. Their actions start communicating something they may struggle to say directly. I don't want to lose what we have. That is emotional growth. They're learning that staying connected does not automatically mean surrendering their freedom. In fact, a healthy relationship can give their independence a deeper meaning because now they are choosing connection rather than being forced into it. Protecting the bond becomes their quiet form of commitment. They may not casually make promises about forever, but their actions start moving in that direction. They show up when it matters. They consider how important decisions affect both people. They begin making room for the relationship in their future. When misunderstandings happen, they care enough to protect what exists between you instead of simply walking away. These actions may look ordinary from the outside, but for someone whose instinct was once to stand completely alone, they can carry enormous emotional meaning. Deep love can be frightening, because caring deeply also means becoming vulnerable to pain. Yet when they continue choosing the relationship, even while fear is still present, they're making a meaningful decision. This connection is worth the risk. That is emotional maturity. They are no longer simply trying to survive love. They're beginning to learn how to build a life within it. When someone with avoidant patterns starts protecting the relationship, they've begun moving from isolation toward inclusion. They aren't only protecting their heart from you anymore, they're learning how to protect the relationship alongside you. And that quiet devotion may not be obvious to everyone watching from the outside, but the person experiencing it can feel the difference. Their effort becomes more consistent, their communication becomes more intentional, their presence becomes less conditional, and slowly, the relationship stops feeling like something they might escape from at any moment, and starts feeling like something they genuinely want to preserve. That shift can be subtle, but don't underestimate it. For someone who once believed distance was the safest answer, choosing to stay is not a small decision. It can be one of the clearest signs that their feelings have moved beyond simple attraction and into something much deeper. Their care becomes more deliberate, their presence becomes more reliable. What once made them uncomfortable becomes something they're now willing to protect. Love from someone with avoidant patterns rarely looks like an endless flow of dramatic words, overwhelming affection, or movie-style romance. It is usually quieter, more grounded, and much harder to recognize unless you understand what their behavior is actually communicating. For someone with avoidant tendencies, love can exist inside the tension between wanting closeness and being afraid of it. They may spend years believing that emotional dependence is dangerous, so when they finally allow themselves to remain, that decision can carry a meaning most people will never fully understand. Their love may not appear perfect from the outside, but when it becomes more secure, it can become deeply rooted, because it is built through consistency rather than performance. People with avoidant patterns often depend on emotional control and personal distance, because those things help them feel protected. Their fear of dependence doesn't necessarily mean they are incapable of deep feelings. Sometimes it means those feelings are stronger than they know how to manage. And when they genuinely develop strong feelings for someone, that carefully controlled inner world starts changing. They begin caring more than they intended to. They feel more deeply than they feel comfortable admitting. They think about you during moments when they once would have focused only on themselves. Slowly, almost without noticing, the person who once believed they were safest alone begins discovering another kind of safety, being understood, being accepted, and making the choice to stay. Even when they feel something deeply, they may still struggle to put those emotions into words. Instead, their feelings often become visible through consistency. They may not constantly tell you how much you mean to them, but when you genuinely need them, they show up. They may not overwhelm you with affection every day, yet they remember the small things that make you comfortable, the situations that stress you, and the details that matter to you. For someone with avoidant tendencies, deep love can mean slowly creating space for you inside a world they once kept completely private. You may notice it through the quiet adjustments they make without asking for recognition. They begin changing their routines, so you naturally become part of their life. They make room for you without making a big announcement about it. You may also notice that silence feels different around them. They can sit beside you without feeling the need to escape, explain themselves, or fill every quiet second with conversation. Your presence stops feeling intrusive and begins feeling peaceful. That is a significant change for someone who once depended on distance to feel safe. And if you've been waiting for a dramatic sign, pay attention here, because this quiet shift can tell you far more than a grand declaration ever could. Their love isn't necessarily about constantly proving how much they care. It is about protecting what has been created between you. Instead of chasing emotional highs, they begin appreciating the calm that comes from simply having someone they trust nearby. Their version of saying, "I'm here," may never arrive through a dramatic confession. It may simply be demonstrated by the fact that they continue showing up. When someone with avoidant tendencies genuinely sees you as a person they want in their life long term, their devotion often hides inside ordinary behavior. They may not make huge promises about the future, but they keep making small efforts that help the relationship remain strong. They understand personal space because they need it themselves. So when they care deeply, they may also become protective of your need for solitude. They don't want to create unnecessary emotional chaos because peace has become one of the ways they understand love. They may make choices that protect the stability of the relationship, even when they cannot fully explain why those choices matter. Sometimes their loyalty can even be mistaken for emotional distance, but there is an important difference between being emotionally unavailable and expressing affection quietly. Someone with avoidant patterns who is genuinely invested may not constantly seek reassurance or attention.